So about a year ago, almost a year ago to the day, I got one of these in the mail. How many of you recognize what that is? Yeah? How many of you have gotten one of these red light violations? Okay, just keep your hands up, hold them up high. I want to proclaim loudly and proudly, you are my people. There's just this wave of thoughts and emotions that went through my head when I got the mail that day and I saw this notice in the mail. The biggest thing that I felt at that point was denial, right? There's no way this could have happened. They got it wrong. But the pictures are there for a reason. Our car was clearly behind the line when the light turned red. Our car clearly rolled through that intersection turning right, and the light was still red. And then there's that nasty zoom in they put in with your license plate. It's like I wanted to claim it was somebody else's car, but we were guilty. And I started thinking about how I was going to tell Connie about this when she got home from work. All right, let me be honest. I started thinking about how I could hide this from Connie when she got home from work, because these things aren't cheap, right? It's like $125. And then I looked at the pictures again, and I realized it wasn't my car. It was Connie's car. Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? I mean, the evidence is clear. She'd been careless. She'd been reckless. She'd put herself and our new vehicle in danger. I mean, God forbid one of our grandkids was in the car with her. And so, I'm not proud of this, okay? But I'm just telling you the truth of what happened. I opened my calendar for more proof. I wanted to know where we both were that day and prove beyond a reasonable doubt, like I'm Perry Mason or something, beyond a reasonable doubt that she was the one who got this red light violation. And when I looked at my calendar, it was true. She was there. She was in the vehicle as a passenger. And I was the driver. I'm going to tell you that little piece of information was helpful for changing the direction of the start of that conversation. And I realized as I thought about this, I just played this back in my head this week. This, what I refer to as a series of unfortunate events. I played it back in my head and I realized when we're wrong, grace is what we hunger for, right? When we forget, when we mess up, when we make mistakes, when our words and our actions hurt people intentionally or not, when we harm others, when we slight others, when we're jealous or angry or defenseless or defensive, when we are confronted by our guilt, grace is what we crave for ourselves. So why is it then, when the tables are turned, that grace is often what we withhold from others? So we're in this second week of this new teaching series based on Romans chapter 12, and we've called it Living All Out. And in the series, we're asking a really important question about our faith. What would happen if we disrupted our lives, the normal way that we do things, the normal way that we think and act and interact and relate to people? What if we interrupted our normal ways of doing things and decided to live all out the way the Bible teaches about different facets of our lives? Today we're going to consider how living all out in grace would change our lives. And I think I've already established the fact that at least I need to hear this message, whether you do or not, right? We all need a better approach to grace. Paul is actually the best teacher that we could have on this whole idea of how we view others and how we extend grace. Prior to encountering Jesus, Paul was an aristocratic snob. It's not a debate, it's just the truth about his life. He had gotten the equivalent of an Ivy League education from the best teachers in the land. He was a Pharisee, and the Pharisees were the religious elite of the day. And when you understand and study Paul's backstory from the epistles that he wrote and from the book of Acts, it paints him as this arrogant, self-righteous, and proud man. before grace. And if that weren't enough, Paul was personally responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of Christians being arrested, imprisoned, and killed simply because they had a faith in Jesus. Many years after his conversion, Paul writes these words in Romans 12, verse 3, when he says, "For by the grace given me." It's a great phrase for Paul when you understand his story. It's a grace that not only forgave his sins, but allowed him to be a powerful force in the spread of Christianity. And as Paul writes these words, he's painfully aware of where he would be and where he was without grace. From that humble place, he calls us to live out the same grace that we have received and that he knows. He says, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, don't think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." Knowing Paul's story adds a depth to these words. Before grace, he had an inflated ego. He saw himself simply through the influence and the position that he had worked really hard to attain in his life. He had earned this, and he lived, therefore, in a place of pride and power. After grace, he was still a force to be reckoned with. But God leveled the playing field for Paul by extending grace to him. It changed how he thought about how he felt about, how he interacted with the people around him. Every thought and action from that point on for Paul was measured in the light of the grace he had been given. The word grace has lots of definitions. Webster's dictionary has a wide variety of those. But I think the simplest one that I've ever heard for grace from a biblical perspective is just two words. Grace is unmerited favor. Grace puts us in a standing with God that we could never earn. And if that same grace, the Bible goes on to teach, doesn't translate into our everyday actions, then we've missed the point. It's normal for us to get irritated with people, to get upset with people. And I would guess that your list of irritating people and irritating habits that people can have, your list of irritations is different than mine. But what God teaches us in his words, if we're going to live all out, we have to learn a different way to respond to those irritations in our life. Living in grace means we just simply acknowledge that everyone has faults and weaknesses and everybody has a bad day. And it means we love them in spite of and through that. And we're never going to be perfect at this thing of extending grace to other people. But what we can do is we can begin to think about what would it be like if grace had that place in our lives? How would it change our relationships with family, with friends, even with complete strangers that we meet? What if everything we did and said was grounded in grace? Now, I want to focus on three tension points where we struggle with this extending grace thing this morning. And they're not the only ones. In fact, they may not even be the most prominent ones in your life. But these are ones that I encounter with people and that I see in myself really often. And I hope that at least the conversation this morning will trigger some thoughts for you on where you can grow in grace, where you can move towards this all-out grace that the Bible calls us to live in. First of those areas is I am confident grace believes the best in others. That's a phrase I picked up at a place I worked years and years ago. It was one of the core values of that place. Grace believes the best. It doesn't mean that grace is blind to or ignores the truth. But there's often in our heads this line we cross where we have a few facts. There's a little bit of truth, and we imply the rest. Right? Doesn't ignore the truth, but it doesn't go beyond the truth. Grace isn't blind. It's not grace to ignore that someone has hurt us. It's not grace to ignore that we've hurt someone else. Grace just simply says, I won't try to assign a motive to their words or actions before we can talk this through. I'm just going to believe that you didn't mean things the way they came across. We lose grace in our relationships when we begin to assign motives to people. We imagine all the possible reasons they did or said what they did. Anybody go there? Somebody hurts you, somebody disrespects you. That's what it is when they're late to a meeting with you. It's disrespect. Or they're still upset about something you said last week. That's why they made that snarky comment on Facebook or Twitter. We read between the lines when we get emails and voicemails and texts. And as we do, we start to imagine their motives. We start to imagine the outcomes. And then we start to form the decisions that we're going to take based on what we've projected onto them. The default mode for grace is simply to believe the best in your spouse, in your kids, in your friends. Now look, I know my friends are not perfect. I know my kids are not perfect. I know my spouse is not perfect. She'll be at second service. I know my grandkids are probably the closest to perfection in my life of anyone I know. But they're still not perfect. And you know who else isn't perfect? Me. Because of the grace that we've been given, because of the grace we want to live in, we're called to be humble and to remember we're human just like them. We all make mistakes, sometimes carelessly. And when those mistakes happen, we don't catastrophize them. We believe the best in the other person. I think grace also recognizes and respects differences in people. It's not too hard for us to notice differences, right? Are you there? Yeah. We notice them pretty carefully. Some of them are big differences, and some of them just don't really matter to us. I'm a child of the 60s, and hair was a big thing in the churches I grew up in. Why in the world would a guy grow his hair long? Well, I mean, the Beatles introduced us to that, right? Why would a guy grow his hair long? That was a big conversation in the churches I grew up in. I kind of went, I don't really care, right? It's just hair. It's never been a thing to me. Not the color of the hair. I don't care whether it's black or blonde or a redhead or gray. I don't even mind bald heads. Maybe it's because mine is heading that way, right? It's just never been a thing for me. It's one of those differences I could care less about. But that's not true of every difference I encounter. Well, I'll just tell you, probably as recently as 15 years ago, I struggled when people have tattoos. When I grew up, my family was taught those are wrong. You should never do that, right? And I struggled with it. I mean, I would see a tattoo on someone, I go, really? That's the choice you made? That glorious leaping dolphin is not going to look the same when you're older, and your skin is not so taut. It's going to look more like a beached whale that's been crying for help too long. And then a few years ago, I had a conversation with a young lady. And her arm was just covered in tattoos. And as I gained trust, she began to share with me that the tattoos were her way to show that her life had been changed. A lot of stress, some abuse in her life. And the only way she knew to manage the stress and the pain as an adolescent was cutting. The tattoos were her way of saying, my life has changed. That's not who I am anymore. Her tattoos hid the scars. I don't look at tattoos the same. Hearing her story helped me understand and respect the differences in us. Now, when I see a nice sleeve of tattoos, when I see a tattoo that has great depth and great texture to it and great color, it's an open door for a conversation if they're willing. And somebody reaches out to you at lunch today and set your food on the table and you see tattoos. It can be a doorway to a conversation as opposed to not understanding differences. Look, there's a million ways that we're different as people. We're different in our political views. We're different in our goals and values and dreams. We're different in our likes and our dislikes. And we're even different and unique in our faith. Your spiritual journey is not like anybody else's. It has its own twists and turns and ups and downs. And I can promise you, your journey is not like anybody else's in this room this morning or anyone else you'll meet. It's unique to you. We are all different. Grace is choosing, when we see those differences between us and someone else, choosing to cheer and to celebrate those differences rather than complain and criticize. Paul says it this way a couple of chapters later in Romans. He says, look, welcome with open arms fellow believers who don't see things the way you do. And don't jump all over them every time they say or do something you don't agree with, even when it seems they're strong on opinions and weak in the faith department. I love that. Remember, they have their own history to deal with. Treat them gently. And so when we see differences, when people make choices that are different than the ones that we would make, we treat them gently because of grace. One more area that may be the hardest one for us. Grace gives and receives forgiveness easily. Easily. Without qualification. Without question. If moving someone into the "you're forgiven" box in our lives has qualifications or conditions attached to it, that's not grace. Remember the definition of grace? Unmerited favor. We did nothing to earn our salvation. We did nothing for the sins of our past and our present that God forgives us for. Grace is forgiving another even when it's undeserved. Not because we can see change in their life. Not because they've come back and apologized and now we'll forgive them. Often we're called to forgive in spite of their actions and in spite of their words. In Colossians, Paul writes, make allowances for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. He didn't leave a lot of wiggle room in there, did he? I'm not happy with the way Paul wrote that. I'd love to rewrite it. I have a couple of exceptions I'd like to put in there in my life. What about you? There's not much wiggle room. Forgive anyone who offends you. Why? Remember, the Lord forgave you, and you must forgive others. Grace compels us to forgive. Not because of anything they've done or said, but because of how much we've been forgiven. And that may be the toughest all-out part of grace. We have high standards when it comes to our relationships. We generally do. And that's fine to have those standards as long as you understand those standards are propped up by two imperfect people who are trying to meet those standards. Mistakes and mess-ups are inevitable, and we can work through them as long as we nurture grace more than we nurture our grudges. It's not easy to forgive like this. It doesn't demand a restoration of the relationship. It just demands that you let go of the pain that you're holding on to so it doesn't make you a bitter, angry person. It's exceptional grace. And it's a completely different view of our lives. When we fully grasp how much God has forgiven of us, how much grace He's extended to us, we start seeing people, all people, differently. We see tough times, tough situations, tough people differently when we look through grace. That grace levels the playing field for us, too. We're all sinners in need of God's grace, every single one of us. We need grace from God, and we need grace from the people around us. And until that kind of grace rules our life, it won't rule our relationships. A few years ago, I ran across a story, and I've hung on to it in my office, read it periodically, about this woman, this mom of 4 in Oklahoma named Jessica, who modeled this kind of grace. She was in the grocery store just picking up groceries for her family, not paying a whole lot of attention until she noticed there was a man who was following her. She was on a pretty erratic path in a hurry in the grocery store, and he was following every step she made. Concerned her a little bit, but she kind of forgot about it. A couple hours later, she looked down at her purse, and her wallet was gone. She made a decision to find the man rather than call the police. It's a pretty gutsy move, right? She'd been toughened. She had 4 kids, so maybe that's what helped. She confronted the man when she found him. Here's what she said: "I think you have something of mine, and I'm going to give you a choice. You can give my wallet back, and I will forgive you. In fact, I'll even buy those groceries for you that you have in your cart. Or you can refuse. But if you do, I will call the police. Choice is yours." It's a gutsy gal. They stood there in silence, looking at each other for just a minute. And then he reached into the pockets of his hoodie and pulled out her wallet. And he handed it back to her. And together they walked to the front of the store, and he checked out his groceries. She pulled cash out of her billfold and paid for his groceries: a loaf of bread, some bananas, some lunch meat, some milk. $27 worth of groceries. And as she paid, he began to cry. And he just kept saying over and over again, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And he looked at her and he said, "I'm just desperate. I'm out of work, and I need food for my kids, and I didn't know what else to do. I'm embarrassed, and I'm so sorry." And then she looked at him and she said, "You know, it's okay. Sometimes all we need is a second chance to turn things around." That's grace. I don't know. In fact, I hope nobody steals your wallet in the grocery store today. I don't know where you're struggling to extend grace in your life, but you have places, and so do I, that we can grow. Things are going to have to change if we're going to take grace and live it all out in our lives, if that becomes a defining characteristic of our life. I don't know where you struggle with grace, but what I know is you've got something to work on, and so do I. We have areas in our life where we tend to give justice instead of grace, where we pray for revenge instead of grace, or we just simply hold it a little longer so the other person feels the pain that we've felt. Wherever it is that you struggle, wherever it is that I struggle, we've got some work to do. I love in the message how Paul puts this challenge to us. Makes it really clear in Galatians 5. It says, "Since this is the kind of life we have chosen, a grace-filled life of the Spirit, let us make sure that we don't just hold it as an idea in our heads or a sentiment in our hearts, but work out its implications in every detail of our lives." And that means we will not compare ourselves with each other as if one of us is better and another worse. We have far more interesting things to do with our lives. Each of us is an original. Each of us is called to extend that kind of grace.